The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room buzzed with anticipation as Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana leaned back in his leather chair with the confident smile of a man who had spent decades using folksy charm and sharp questioning to dismantle witnesses, completely unaware that Representative Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table with a meticulously organized briefcase containing 3 years of his contradictory statements, voting record inconsistencies, and documented policy flip-flops that would systematically destroy every homespun criticism he was about to deliver. Kennedy, with his distinctive Louisiana drawl and reputation for reducing complex issues to colorful metaphors that played perfectly on television, adjusted his microphone and prepared to deliver what he clearly expected would be a career-defining takedown of the young Texas congresswoman who had dared to challenge his infrastructure spending positions during recent budget negotiations. "Well now, Representative Crockett," Kennedy began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had turned Senate hearings into theater, "I've been listening to your testimony about infrastructure policy, and I have to say, it sounds like you're trying to teach your grandmother how to suck eggs." The gallery chuckled appreciatively at Kennedy's trademark folksy wisdom, having no idea they were about to witness one of the most methodical, evidence-based destructions of a sitting senator in congressional history. Senator John Kennedy commanded respect across political circles as one of the most effective questioners in the Senate, his Harvard Law and Oxford backgrounds hidden beneath a carefully cultivated persona of Louisiana common sense that had made him a formidable opponent in committee hearings and a sought-after television guest. His ability to distill complex legal and policy issues into memorable sound bites had earned him millions of social media followers and made him one of the most quoted senators in America. When Kennedy spoke in his distinctive drawl about constitutional principles or government spending, his colleagues listened. Conservative media amplified his message, and even Democratic opponents acknowledged his skill at connecting with ordinary Americans through relatable analogies and humor. Representative Jasmine Crockett, despite being relatively new to Congress, had quickly established herself as one of the most thorough and prepared members of the House, her background as a civil rights attorney having taught her the importance of meticulous research and systematic presentation of evidence. What many senators didn't realize was that Crockett's legal practice had included extensive work on government accountability cases, giving her detailed knowledge of how to track and document the kinds of policy inconsistencies that often went unnoticed in the fast-paced world of congressional politics. Her reputation for preparation had made even veteran members wary of underestimating her in committee settings, though Kennedy's confidence suggested he hadn't received that particular memo. The tension between Kennedy and Crockett had been building since her appearance before the House Budget Committee 6 weeks earlier, where she had criticized what she called performative politics that prioritized memorable quotes over consistent policy positions. Her testimony had included specific references to senators who she claimed changed positions based on political convenience rather than principled analysis, generating significant media attention and prompting several conservative commentators to suggest that a freshman representative was overstepping her bounds by challenging experienced senators. Kennedy, who typically ignored criticism from House members, had specifically requested this oversight hearing to address Crockett's comments, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate why years of Senate experience mattered more than what he viewed as naive policy analysis. Before we reveal how Jasmine Crockett completely destroys Senator Kennedy with systematic evidence, make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because what happens next will shock you about political hypocrisy, and we've got more incredible congressional confrontations coming your way. Representative Crockett, Kennedy continued, his folksy charm on full display as he gestured with the theatrical flair that had made him a favorite on cable news shows. Your recent comments about infrastructure spending remind me of a story my grandfather used to tell about a city fellow who came down to Louisiana trying to teach us how to catch crawfish. Now, we'd been catching crawfish for generations, but this fellow had a college degree and a lot of fancy theories about crustacean behavior. The gallery chuckled again as Kennedy warmed to his theme, clearly enjoying the setup for what he intended to be a devastating analogy. Well, turns out this college fellow couldn't catch a crawfish if it crawled right up to him and introduced itself. The moral of the story, Representative Crockett, is that sometimes experience matters more than education, and maybe you might want to learn a thing or two about how infrastructure spending actually works before you start criticizing senators who've been doing this work since before you were born. Crockett remained perfectly composed despite the condescending nature of Kennedy's analogy, her expression calm as she organized the thick stack of documents she had brought to the hearing. Senator Kennedy, I appreciate your colorful storytelling, and I certainly respect your years of experience in the Senate. However, before we continue with analogies about crawfish, I'd like to address some apparent inconsistencies between your current positions on infrastructure spending and votes you've cast over the past several years. Kennedy's confident expression shifted slightly, a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested he wasn't expecting Crockett to challenge his voting record directly. Well now, Representative Crockett, I'm not sure what you think you found, but I can assure you that my positions on infrastructure have been as consistent as sunrise over the Atchafalaya Basin. I appreciate that assurance, Senator Kennedy, Crockett replied, opening her briefcase methodically as cameras captured every movement. That's what makes some of your voting patterns particularly interesting to examine. For instance, in 2019, you voted against the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, stating in your floor speech that federal infrastructure spending represents wasteful government overreach that burdens taxpayers with unnecessary debt. She displayed Kennedy's 2019 floor speech transcript on the committee room screen. Yet just 18 months later, in 2021, you enthusiastically supported the CHIPS and Science Act, which included $52 billion in federal infrastructure spending for semiconductor manufacturing. In your press release supporting the bill, you stated that strategic federal infrastructure investment is essential for American competitiveness and represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking government spending that creates jobs and strengthens our economy. A murmur rippled through the committee room as observers recognized the apparent contradiction in Kennedy's positions. Kennedy shifted in his chair, his folksy confidence showing the first signs of strain. Well, Representative Crockett, those were different types of infrastructure spending addressing different national priorities and economic conditions. I understand that different infrastructure projects serve different purposes, Crockett acknowledged respectfully. That's why I've brought several other examples to help clarify the consistency of your infrastructure philosophy. In your criticism of my infrastructure proposals today, you emphasized that federal spending should be limited to essential projects with clear national benefits. Yet your voting record shows you supported $15 billion in federal funding for rural broadband expansion in Louisiana, while simultaneously voting against $12 billion for urban transit infrastructure that served multiple states. She turned to another section in her materials. Both projects met the same economic criteria for job creation and national competitiveness. But the Louisiana project received your enthusiastic support, while the multi-state project received your opposition. How do you reconcile supporting infrastructure spending that benefits Louisiana while opposing similar spending that benefits other states? Kennedy's discomfort became more visible as he struggled to explain the apparent inconsistency without admitting that geographical considerations influenced his infrastructure positions. Representative Crockett, senators have a responsibility to represent their state's interests while also considering national priorities and fiscal responsibility. I completely agree that senators should represent their state's interests, Crockett responded calmly. That's what makes your criticism of my infrastructure advocacy particularly puzzling. In your opening statement today, you suggested that my support for Texas infrastructure projects demonstrates parochial thinking that prioritizes regional interests over national needs. Yet in this interview you gave to the Baton Rouge Advocate last year, you stated, "Every senator's first responsibility is to fight for their state's infrastructure needs. That's not parochial politics. That's principled representation of the people who elected you." She displayed the Baton Rouge Advocate interview on the screen, causing audible reactions throughout the committee room. These positions seem directly contradictory. When you advocate for Louisiana infrastructure, it's principled representation. When I advocate for Texas infrastructure, it's parochial thinking. What principle distinguishes these two approaches to state advocacy? The tension in the committee room intensified as Kennedy realized he was facing a methodical examination of his own inconsistencies rather than the defensive policy discussion he had anticipated. Representative Crockett, there's a difference between advocating for legitimate state needs and promoting unnecessary federal spending for political purposes. I appreciate that distinction, Crockett replied, referencing her documents. That's why I'd like to examine your criteria for distinguishing legitimate needs from unnecessary spending. In your 2020 press release celebrating $8 billion in federal hurricane recovery funding for Louisiana, you stated that federal disaster spending is not optional. It's a moral obligation to help Americans rebuild their communities and their lives. She turned to another document. Yet just 6 months later, you voted against $6 billion in federal disaster relief for Texas winter storm victims, stating that continuous federal bailouts create dependency and undermine state responsibility for emergency preparedness. Both disasters caused similar economic damage and affected similar numbers of Americans. What principle distinguishes Louisiana disaster victims deserving federal assistance from Texas disaster victims who don't? Kennedy's composure continued to deteriorate as the systematic presentation of contradictions made his earlier confident assertions about principled governance appear increasingly untenable. Representative Crockett, disaster response involves complex considerations of federal resources, state preparedness, and long-term policy implications that may not be apparent to those without extensive experience in federal budgeting. I respect the complexity of federal disaster policy, Crockett responded. That's why I'd like to address your specific characterization of my policy understanding. In your opening statement today, you suggested that my infrastructure analysis demonstrates inexperience that disqualifies me from meaningful policy discussions. Yet in this letter you wrote to the Louisiana Congressional delegation just 14 months ago, you praised my sophisticated understanding of federal infrastructure policy and nuanced analysis of state-federal partnerships. The display of Kennedy's own letter created the most significant audience reaction yet, with several observers audibly expressing surprise at the stark contradiction. The letter specifically commended my infrastructure expertise, stating that my approach represented exactly the kind of thoughtful policy analysis that strengthens federal-state cooperation. Has your assessment of my policy expertise changed dramatically in 14 months, or are these contradictory evaluations? Kennedy attempted to maintain his senatorial composure, but his responses became increasingly defensive as the hearing format prevented him from avoiding the systematic presentation of his contradictions. Representative Crockett, policy assessments can evolve based on new information and changing political circumstances in Washington. That's certainly true, Crockett acknowledged. Evolution in policy thinking is natural and often valuable. But what concerns me is that today's characterizations present these positions as long-standing principles rather than recent evolutions. More importantly, these contradictions raise questions about consistency in infrastructure policy that go beyond our personal disagreement. She organized her documents carefully as the cameras captured every movement. For instance, in your current opposition to federal infrastructure investment, you argue that such spending represents dangerous expansion of federal power that threatens state sovereignty. Yet in your 2018 book, American Grit, you wrote, "Strategic federal infrastructure investment represents constitutional federal responsibility and demonstrates exactly the kind of federal leadership that strengthens rather than threatens state autonomy." The display of Kennedy's own book created another wave of reaction throughout the committee room. These positions aren't just personally contradictory. They represent fundamentally different philosophies about federal power and constitutional responsibility. Which understanding of federal infrastructure authority actually guided your voting record over the past 5 years? Kennedy's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort as he struggled to address the systematic presentation of his contradictory positions. The committee members could sense the dramatic shift in momentum, with several senators leaning forward to observe Kennedy's response to Crockett's methodical presentation. "Representative Crockett," Kennedy said finally, his distinctive drawl noticeably less confident than at the beginning of the hearing. "Infrastructure policy involves complex balancing of federal resources, state needs, and fiscal responsibility that may not always appear consistent when viewed through a political rather than a practical lens. I respect the complexity of infrastructure policy," Crockett replied. "That's why I've focused on your own statements and votes rather than offering my own interpretations. What we're examining here isn't complexity, it's contradiction. When the same infrastructure principles are applied in directly opposite ways depending on which state benefits, it raises fundamental questions about equal treatment under federal policy." She turned to her most damaging set of materials. "Perhaps most significantly, in your criticism of my infrastructure proposals today, you argued that federal spending should be merit-based and politically neutral. Yet your infrastructure voting record shows a clear pattern of supporting projects that benefit Louisiana while opposing similar projects that benefit other states, regardless of their economic merit or national importance." The final presentation created the most significant reaction yet, with the committee room clearly recognizing the implications of Crockett's systematic analysis. The broadband funding, disaster relief patterns, and infrastructure project selections don't represent complex policy analysis. They represent exactly the kind of political calculation based on state benefit rather than national merit that you're criticizing in my proposals. Committee Chairman Dick Durbin, recognizing the extraordinary nature of what had unfolded, leaned forward to address both witnesses. "Senator Kennedy, we're approaching the end of this session. Would you like to respond to Representative Crockett's presentation of your voting record?" Kennedy sat in silence for several moments, the systematic presentation of his contradictions having effectively dismantled his earlier confident assertions about principled infrastructure policy. Finally, he spoke, his voice subdued and lacking its earlier theatrical flourish. Representative Crockett has clearly done extensive research into my record. Perhaps we should focus on moving forward with infrastructure policies that serve all Americans rather than relitigating past votes and statements. I agree completely that we should focus on effective infrastructure policy, Crockett responded respectfully. That's precisely why consistency in policy principles matters. When we acknowledge that infrastructure voting can be influenced by state political considerations, we can work together to create merit-based criteria that ensure federal spending serves national rather than parochial interests. She gathered her materials with quiet dignity as the cameras captured the moment. Senator Kennedy, your years of experience are valuable, but experience combined with consistent principles serves the American people better than experience combined with political convenience. I hope we can work together to develop infrastructure policies that apply the same standards regardless of which states benefit. As the hearing concluded, Kennedy's famous confidence had been replaced by a subdued acknowledgement that his attempt to use folksy charm and senatorial authority to dismiss a young representative had backfired spectacularly. The committee members recognized they had witnessed something unprecedented, a systematic evidence-based takedown that had exposed years of policy inconsistencies hidden beneath Kennedy's carefully cultivated persona. The aftermath extended far beyond the Senate committee room as political analysts, infrastructure policy experts, and government accountability advocates examined the comprehensive presentation of voting record contradictions that had unfolded during the hearing. Within hours, clips of the confrontation were circulating on social media, with government transparency organizations praising Crockett's methodical approach to accountability. The Sunlight Foundation issued a statement within hours. Representative Crockett's systematic analysis of Senator Kennedy's voting record demonstrates exactly why congressional accountability requires comprehensive research rather than relying on political rhetoric or persona. The Government Accountability Institute noted that this type of methodical examination of voting patterns provides a model for how citizens and journalists should evaluate the consistency of their elected representatives. Conservative policy analysts found themselves acknowledging the effectiveness of Crockett's presentation, despite disagreeing with her infrastructure positions. The American Enterprise Institute's congressional scholar observed, regardless of one's views on federal spending, Crockett's research was thorough, and her presentation was methodical. This is what oversight looks like when supported by comprehensive documentation rather than political theater. Meanwhile, Kennedy's office worked to contain the damage from what political commentators were already calling one of the most comprehensive exposures of policy inconsistency in recent Senate history. A carefully worded statement attempted to provide context for the voting patterns Crockett had highlighted, but the explanation only drew more attention to the contradictions that had been systematically documented. By the following morning, major news outlets had published detailed analyses of the infrastructure voting patterns that Crockett had presented. The Associated Press conducted an independent review of Kennedy's voting record and confirmed the accuracy of every contradiction Crockett had highlighted, while also identifying additional examples of similar inconsistencies that hadn't been mentioned during the hearing. What had begun as Senator Kennedy's attempt to use his folksy charm and senatorial experience to diminish a young representative had transformed into a defining moment for congressional accountability, proving that thorough preparation and systematic evidence presentation could overcome even the most skilled political performers when their records contradicted their rhetoric. The confrontation would be studied in political science classes as a master class in how methodical research and respectful presentation could expose policy inconsistencies more effectively than theatrical rhetoric or personal attacks.